To create our first scene template for our branch sets, we are going to need to modify view a little and set up certain areas of the scene and do a couple of things we normally wouldn't do with the camera to kind of set this up. So first what I want to do is go into our atmosphere editor, and I'm using my default atmosphere right now, which has a lot of clouds in it and things that are really going to slow down the render. But I'm going to go and load in an atmosphere, and we're going to use the default atmosphere that is set within view under spectral sunshine default. And now I'm going to go to the atmosphere editor, select sun, and I'm going to adjust our pitch to 90 and our azimuth to 180. And we're going to change this to environment mapped. So really the position of the sun doesn't matter too much. And I'm going to go ahead and change this to the standard lighting model. And if we go to effects, I am going to invert our environment map and select map ground plane. And what this is doing is creating an entirely white background for our scene. It is putting a white surface on our ground plane and also our sky. We can go ahead and click OK. And now everything in the scene is basically going to be pretty much white. I'm going to take our ground, which I have set to kind of a grass, and go ahead and change that to rocks default, which is the default surface, and change the color, edit our color map to white. And then I'm going to go back into our atmosphere editor, make sure there is no fog, no haze, no glow intensity. I'm going to turn off wind, and that should be pretty good for everything to start up with. Our ambient light color, I do want to change to white, and our light color, make sure it is set to white as well, because we're really using this to set up our texture maps and not create any sort of scene that we're going to be rendering our plants in realistically with certain sun colors. I'm going to go ahead and change our ground plane to the automatic from the green. And I'm going to go ahead and save this just where we're at right now, making sure we're saving quite frequently so we don't lose any of our information. And what I'm going to do is add in a plane. So we're going to right mouse click on our objects panel, select plane, and I'm going to move this up from our ground plane a little. Another thing you could also do is delete the ground plane entirely, but for right now I want to keep it just so we have a good idea where all of our objects are, because one nice thing about even having the ground plane in here is when we zoom out we can tell exactly where that line is throughout the scene. So if we get lost kind of moving around throughout the scene, which you'll see can somewhat happen with the way we have to set up the camera for this to work, because the camera is going to be extremely far away from our scene. I'm going to select our plane, and I'm going to double-click just on that surface to bring up our material editor, and I'm going to change the name to branches, and just click OK for right now. And we're going to move in just with our main camera, although we'll be rendering and switching to our top camera. And now with our plane selected, I'm going to select the numerics tab and go to our size option and change the X and the Y to 10 meters. Actually, we'll go ahead and do 20, just to make that a little bit bigger, a little easier to see. And I'm also going to come down here and add a new layer. And I'm going to call this layer branches. And now we can drag that plane into there, our new layer, and rename our plane branch. And now we can select that image plane once again, or that plane. And I'm going to open up our material, and then right mouse click on color production and go to edit function. I'm going to delete all of our nodes we currently have by default, and I just click in here to create the invisible red box. I'm also going to scale this down so we can see the entire function editor. Go ahead and move down our position in all of our top nodes and add in a projected texture map. So we'll select texture map, and if you don't have projected texture map on, you can go ahead and change that to projected texture map. And now we're going to load in our image, and I will actually need to create a new collection with those files we just saved out. So we're going to go down to the bottom and select New Collection. And I've just selected the folder that I saved everything in, and I'm going to call it Custom Leaves. And click OK. And now we have our leaves and our branches. So since first we're working on our branch, I'm going to load in our branch color and click OK. And I'm going to change our mapping mode to flat vertical and connect our color to the color output of our projected texture. And next what I'm going to do is select our texture, create another node. So we're going to add in another texture map node, which now has the same settings as our previous one. And we'll go ahead and load in that clip and connect our alpha to the grayscale output and our transparency to our grayscale output. Now that alpha is there in case you have an image format where you can save the alpha and the color or grayscale together into the same file, and that way you can select whether or not you want the alpha or the grayscale. But these are JPEGs, so they don't have those multiple layers. And we're just using a JPEG to save on the file size. You can go ahead and click OK. And now we can see that showing up. And of course our branches are showing up several times on top of this. We're going to open up branch and our material again, and I'm going to change our mapping mode from world standard to object parametric. And now it is going to show up just our branch on top of this image plane. We also see a shadow being cast onto the ground plane. So I'm going to select our ground plane and open up the material for it and turn off receive shadows, cast shadows, anti-alias, indirect lighting, and turn off all of those options, and then go into our branch, open that up, and turn off cast and receive shadows. And now we don't have to worry about those showing up within the scene. I'm now going to switch to our top camera, which we can do by selecting the arrow up here in our camera viewer, and we can undo that rotation. We're going to need to set up the scene a little bit more. I'm going to open up our render options, and what I want to do is set this to render to screen and change this to square. So it's 1, 1. And I'm going to set this to other 1024 by 1024, which is our total amount of pixels for our render. And everything else should be fine right now. I'm going to change this to just our final mode. We can increase the quality of our render a little bit later, but since we're just rendering image maps, we really don't need to worry about changing it too much. Another thing I do want to do is go into our branch material, edit our function, and just make sure that MIP mapping is turned off, because we want full quality and we don't want any of our materials downsized or any of our textures downsized at all for this. Now, when you're working with an actual scene, it's a little bit different. When you're farther away, you're going to want a little bit of increased render speed, so of course you'll want to have those options on, but for now, we don't want to use that because we want the full quality of our texture, no matter how far away the camera is. I'm now going to go into our front view, and we're going to set up our camera so that basically no matter how far away our next layers are, which you'll be able to see, we're not going to have any interference with it traveling on the z-axis. So basically, I'm going to load in a leaf first so we can see it a little bit better and explain why we're going to have the camera so far away. So we're going to add in another plane. I'm going to move this up higher than our branch. And I'm going to create a new layer. Call this layer Leaves. And drag that plane 2 into there. Rename that Leaf. And then open up our material and change that to Leaf. And we can click OK. And now what I want to do is assign the material to this image plane, or just this two-dimensional plane, the same as we did with the branches. To make it a little bit quicker, I'm going to go to our branch, copy our material, and paste it onto our leaf, and then open up that material, rename it Leaf. In this way, all we have to do is really just switch out our image maps. So we'll edit our function, and now we're going to load in our leaf color map and our leaf clipping or alpha map to replace the ones we had before. And now we can see that leaf showing up on our image. Now, because of the way View renders transparency, we need to make sure that all of these planes are not intersecting. So if I select our leaf, and if I was to move this inside of our branch, and basically it would have to be at the exact same height. So let's go ahead and just make a copy of this leaf really quick so you can see why we're going to make the camera adjustments that we need to. I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-C on the keyboard and Control-V to copy and paste and move this off to the side. And let's go ahead and just render and take a look at our image so far. And what we can see is because these two leaves are existing in the same space, we have the outside edges of the image overlapping our other leaf. Now, where our leaves are above our branch layer, it is showing up correctly. So what we need to make sure we're doing is moving all of our leaves on the z-axis above. But once we start working with multiple leaves, you can see that moving this far up on the z-axis is going to change the size of our leaf. So if I go ahead and render this again and we take a look, we can now see our copy of our leaf is much larger. And that's just because of the way perspective works and where our camera is at. So we need to make some very drastic changes to our camera in order to make sure that even though we're going to move these leaves up really high compared to each other, up on the z-axis, up and down, so they're not overlapping, we need to make sure that they're not getting any bigger and they still look the same size. So what I'm going to do is take our top camera and go into our front view and move this up on the z-axis very high And then we're going to use the zoom and the camera focal to zoom in as far as we can. Just moving that up, zooming in more. And the more we do this, the better our perspective is going to be, and the less distortion we have caused by the fact that we have these images much farther away from each other. Now I also want to zoom this out a little bit beyond our branch because we're going to have leaves coming off of the side, and we need to make sure we have enough room for that. Now, of course, we can always adjust our camera afterwards to get it to match up a little bit better, but right now this should look good. So now we can see those two leaves, which is that little bit of a change, are now the same size, and we don't have any increase in the size based on their position. We can also see that color showing up on our branch, and it seems to look pretty good. We have a good blending and the curvature of our bark. And if you wanted to scale down that bark a little bit more, a little more detail, you could always go back to that file and change that. But now what we want to do is go into our front view and just zoom back into those layers we were working on and not worry about the camera. And now we can start taking our leaves and positioning them where we want them on our branches. And what we can do is open up the top view, which will be a little bit easier to work in, and just pay attention to our preview to see if our leaves are going outside. Of course, we do want to make sure, sometimes we'll have a little bit of image offset. So I'm first going to do a little test where I'm just going to take our leaf and move it up right to the end of the branch and render this out and make sure that it is rendering the way it looks within the OpenGL preview. And it looks as if it is. So we're not going to have any problems there. If we take a look in the camera view, it seems to be set up correctly that way too. So now we can go back into our top view, and I'm going to scale this down. I'm going to go back to our leaf 2 that we created, the copy, and just delete that. And I want to make sure that I'm leaving a little bit of space in between the leaf and the branch to make up for a stem. Now we don't actually have a stem showing up, but what we can do is once we have our leaves kind of placed, we can go ahead and create a render, open that up in Photoshop, and then create a file either modifying our bark and branch clip or creating a new layer to make those different stems. And I'm just going to bring this leaf off to the side, angle it a little, and copy and paste, move that over. And now we need to make sure that we're modifying it on the z-axis. So the easiest way to do that is just to go up to our numerics, and then with the move and position option selected, we could just take the z and move it up or down just a tiny little bit. We don't have to go very far with it. We just need to make sure with every copy we create of our leaf that we're moving it either up or down. And basically, you might want to move in the same direction, and that way you never have any overlaps. If every copy you make, you move up, then you know that they're all going to be separate. But if some of you are moving up, some of you are moving down, they might end up existing in the same space and then causing that render problem. And we can go ahead and scale these up, maybe just a little bit more. And you do want to have a little bit of variation on your size so that it looks more realistic. but we want to make sure that we're keeping these planes mostly square. And then in our template file, if we want to make a thinner leaf, we can always create a different shape, something a little thinner. And then it will still match up with the scene file, because you'll be able to use the scene file over and over again. And once we're done, we'll be able to select all of our leaves and then group them together, so we only need to change one material, and then we can swap out our leaves with whatever leaves we would like to have on our different branches. Scale that up a little bit more. Make sure we take each one of these copies and change their position on the Z, which we could either do numerically or with our little position gizmo. And you want to have some overlaps with some of your leaves. And we can go ahead and kind of rotate that a little. And sometimes you need to go into the actual layer to select your leaves, because we do have these boxes overlapping each other, and it can be sometimes hard to just sort of click on it and get it to be selected. So sometimes you will need to go into the layer itself in order to select some of your leaves. Go ahead and copy and paste. And it's a good idea, too, to throw in a render every once in a while, just to make sure that nothing is overlapping with your clip maps. So we'll just go ahead and render this really quick, and we can take a look, make sure everything is appearing correctly, and that looks like it's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and move these out a little bit more, maybe scale up the one on the end. And basically, I'm just going to go through now and add leaves to the rest of our branches, and position them, and then we can take a look at how to finalize the template and even add a little bit extra variation to the color of the leaves that will be global and affect all of our different leaves so that we have some nice variations and it doesn't all look like the same thing. And now I've created several copies of all of our different leaves, and I've made some of them a little bit bigger overall to kind of fill in the area. If we go ahead and take a look at the camera, we can see we will need to adjust it just a little. And let's go ahead and take a look at a render for right now and see how that's going to look. And that doesn't look too bad. May want to increase the leaves size a little bit more to fill in a little bit more of area, but it really depends on what kind of template file you like, because with the leaf we're using right now, we're not filling in the entire square. So if you were to import and bring in another set of leaves, you might have more overlapping than you'd want, or maybe not the right kind of variation. So it's really up to you what you'd like to do with it. But what I'm going to do now is, since we have all of these leaves basically the way I want them, may want to scale them up a little bit more. If we were going to do that, we can select our first leaf in our layer, go down to the bottom to our last leaf, hold down Shift and click on it. And now I'm going to go ahead and open up the top view. If we switch to our scale, we want to make sure we're set to local. And we can go ahead and size these up individually a little bit more. And if you really wanted to make a big impact for your template file and give yourself more flexibility for that size option, because right now it's sizing from the center, Well, if I would have started out, let's go ahead and select one leaf here, with our first leaf, and in its position options, take its pivot point in the pivot position and move that to the end where the stem would be. Then we could scale everything outward from that stem. So you can set your initial position away from the branch and then copy and paste that over. Make sure that all of your leaf objects have that same pivot position. Then every time you did that mass scale, they would still be the same distance from the branch. But I didn't do that to set it up. So one thing you might want to do is maybe create a file like that. Maybe a little bit easier to go ahead and scale that. But for right now, it looks like it should work pretty well. If we take a look at our front and side views, we can see all of our different leaves, different heights. We have no overlaps. And really that matters existing in the same space when they're right next to each other. If we have this leaf over here on the upper right and this leaf down on the bottom in the same area, that's not really going to matter too much because they're not touching each other. It's mainly about the ones that are touching each other and in the same space. So let's go back and select all of our leaves. And what I'm going to do is create a group out of this. So if we go over to the left, we're going to select Group Objects. And now I'm going to call this group Leaves. And now if we want to modify our material, all of these leaves are linked to our group and this one material. So I do want to make a few changes. Go to Edit Function. And we just want to make sure that MIP mapping is off, and it looks as if it is, because we copied this over from our branches. But now, at any time, we have this nice little template. So if we wanted to change our leaves out, all we have to do is change our color for our leaf and our alpha or clip map for our leaf. And that will update all of these different leaves that we have on our branches. And we have our little branch file now. And I am going to adjust our camera a little bit more to zoom in to fill up more of the area, making sure we're really not clipping any of our leaf polygons or planes too much, because then if we load in a leaf that is filling out that outer area, that way we don't screw up the template. But now let's take a look at creating our stems. So one thing I want to do is just go ahead and render this out. And we're going to use this as a reference within Photoshop in order to create a new stem layer. Because it would have been a little difficult before to do that. And since our leaf template doesn't have stems built into it, although you could always create a stem layer within your leaf template if you want to have stems and have that included with your clip maps. I like to do it this way because you never know how far away you want that leaf to be. And you can always create stems that extend far into the leaves to adjust for different sizes and distances. So let's go ahead and just save this out, and we're going to open it up in Photoshop. And then we're going to create and draw out our stems. And now in Photoshop, I have our branch template open, and I want to open that render we just created. And we can also see that the white background that we have on our render for our leaves is a little darker than white, but we will be deleting the ground plane to make up for the alpha, and you'll see why that's important once we get back into view. But what I want to do is just drag that layer into our branch template. I'm going to turn off the bark so that we can just see our branches. And I'm going to set this to multiply for our layer and the render we just created. And what I want to do is just size this up to match the branches that we have. Because that way we can use the same plane size and material setup that we have for the branches right now. And we don't have to worry about adjusting the scale within view and matching that up. Because it's going to be a little bit easier to do that just directly within Photoshop. So once we have the basic shape matched up, and I'm holding down Shift while I'm clicking on the outer side with the free transform to make sure that we're not stretching it at all, because view didn't change its shape, and we do want to make sure that everything is going to be matched up correctly. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but we do want it pretty close. So that should be good. And now what I can do is set this back to normal. And we are going to create a... first we'll go ahead and just create a new group. And I'm going to call this stems. And I want to create a new layer and call that stems. And I'm going to go ahead and adjust our group properties, change that to orange. And I'm going to go to our copies, adjust the group properties, change it to yellow. And that way we can separate this just a little bit more. Bark, group properties, we'll change that to green. And having those color references are really helpful when you're working on more complex images, and if you have a lot of layers, especially with some of the templates you can end up creating. Personally, my leaf template has hundreds and hundreds of layers in it, so the colors can be very useful to separate everything. So we'll go into our stems, and we just need to set up our basic shape. And we can actually use the branch copy and our original branch that we created for this. So we may not need that layer we just created, because you could also paint in exactly where you want the stems. Go ahead and bring that up after making a copy of it, and we can scale that down. And we just want to create this not extremely small, because you don't want it smaller than 1 pixel, because what will happen then is it will just clip out once we have our clip map. It'll get rid of it entirely, and we don't want that to happen. And it'll be clipping out parts of the stem that we'll need. Let's go ahead and just get our initial shape here. And try to set up a length that will be manageable. And I'm going to use the marquee tool to remove some of the pixels we have on the edges. Because as you can see, we're moving into some of the grays. And technically, I guess we could have just drew a smaller box for this, since we have such a small layer. So if you want, you could also draw a box. But one thing to watch out for when you are creating shapes within Photoshop, we'll go ahead and make one right now, is if we are zoomed in and we create, we'll go ahead and change that color to white, or from white to black. I'm just going to create a basic box right now and rasterize it. Now, because we are zoomed into the image, if you take a look on the edges of the box, you're seeing it's not perfect, and we have it fading into gray. So what we'd have to do is go in with the marquee tool and delete those edges. So that can happen when you're creating shapes in Photoshop. Sometimes it only happens, though, when you are zoomed in. So if we go back to 100%, and let's go ahead and create another shape and rasterize it, and now zoom in to take a look, we can see it showing up properly. So most of the time you will be zoomed in while you're working on things and creating shapes, especially smaller ones. So it's always a good idea to take a look at the edges and make sure that it was created properly, because it does seem to be a bug within Photoshop where it will create those edges. So you do have to watch out for that. Let's go ahead and change the color of this to orange to match the rest of our stem layer. And we'll go ahead and change this layer property. We'll name it stem. And we can actually just delete that layer we had created, because we could paint it, but the problem with painting is we're going to end up with some fuzzy edges, and really creating this shape will work out best. Of course, we may end up warping this, so of course we'll run into that problem once again. So let's go ahead and hit Shift-T, free transform. I'm going to move this down. Might even pull it out a little bit. Maybe not that much. Just kind of fine-tuning. Make sure that I turn off snap, so that's not interfering with the size that I want. And now open up our layer properties. And actually we can go ahead and just do this last, changing our color. We'll just work with the black to begin with, and that way we can have our clip map. So I'm going to hit Control-T, turn it off to the side, and now once we do that, we're going to get some of those fuzzy edges, but we do need to warp this and change its shape a little. So we can go back and either use the stroke method or use one of the other methods available to fix the clip. Or another thing we can do is just have our entire plane and entire image be one color for our color map, and not specifically just the stems. And that way we don't have to worry about that overlapping. That will also be very helpful. Since this is going to be going underneath our branches, we can go ahead and intersect that, and it's not going to be a big deal. But I do want to take a look a little farther away and see how big those stems are going to be. And now if you're really going to be downsizing the image more than this for the final render, sometimes you don't even need stems, because your clip map, in order to get it to work properly, you'll either end up with a one pixel stem, which really won't even show up in the render, or your clip map will just cut it out completely. But it looks like this that we have right now, this size, should work out pretty well. And like I said, we don't need to worry about the intersections, because this is going to go under all of our leaves and under all of our branches. So all we need to worry about is where we want to clip out our color. So we can go ahead and just hold down Alt, and now copy and paste all of our stems over into our scene. Now one thing we're seeing, once I rotated this, is these edges are looking not exactly great. And the more we rotate this, you can see the fuzzier it's going to become. And some of that has to do with the resampling, but this should be large enough where that's not going to be a problem. So I'm just going to go ahead, go around our image, and make a bunch of stems that will intersect with our branches and match up to our leaves. And that way we can import this, bring it into view, and then we'll work on our color map. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a bunch of copies for our clip map, and then we're going to create our color. And I now have all of these copied over for all of our stems for our clip. And what I can do is take all of these different layers I created and just shift-click on the last one with the top one selected to select all of them. Control-E to merge them down into one layer. So now at any point, if we'd like to basically create some thinner stems, we can open up our layer style, select stroke, change our color to white, and we'll want to move that into an center. And then we can adjust our size. 1 pixel would really bring it down to the point, basically the minimum of where we'd really want to size this down to. So this looks like it should be good the way it's at. I'm going to turn off the stroke. We can just go ahead and cancel that layer style. Now let's take a look at creating basically our color map for this. And so I'm going to create a new layer, stem color, and I'm going to first pick one of the lighter areas, one of our leaves, for our base color. Go ahead and paint that in there. I'm going to move our stem color just below our black clip. And now we can open up stem color and let's do color overlay. Change this to more of a yellow. I'm just lighten that up a little more because usually the stem is a little bit lighter than the leaf itself. And now to make our color map a little more interesting, I'm going to take our stem, make a copy of it. First I'm going to change this to stem clip, so we know which one is going to be our main black clip. And I'm going to adjust the layer style of our copy, do a color overlay, change that to white, click OK, and now create a new layer, drag it underneath, select both of those layers, the blank one we just created, and the white stems now, and hit Control E. And what that did was basically removed our layer style, so now we just have white stems. And this way we can select multiply, open up our layer style properties for our stem, and we could do color overlay. Let's go ahead and do a drop shadow. I'm going to change our distance down to 0. We'll size that up just a little, reduce the opacity amount 19%. So we'll go to our inner shadow, change that to 19%, change our distance all the way down to 0. And then we can adjust our size to give a little bit of a color variation and sort of a gradient on each of our stems. And that's just going to show up a lot nicer. We could also do inner glow, change the size, the opacity amount, maybe the blending mode. We could change the contour, just to make them look more like realistic looking stems. And now it's going to look, we have a little bit of specular value to that. So basically this is our color map. So I'm going to save this out as our color, and then we can go ahead, turn off our color layer, take our background, make a copy of it, and move it above the other image. And now we can save this out as our clip. And then we can go into View and load those up. And in View, I'm going to select our branches image plane, or plane that we have. I'm going to go to our front view, change this to the Move gizmo, hit Control C and Control V to copy and paste, and now move it down a little bit on our Z-axis, so that is underneath our branch set. And I'm going to change this to stems. Change its name, select that, open it up in the material editor, and change our name of the surface to stems. Click OK, and now we can load in that new image we just created. So we'll open back up the Advanced Material Editor for stems, edit our function, and now we can load in those new stem materials that we have. And it looks like because our library did not have the new folder I created for the stems within it, that we'll have to create a new library, and then we can drag that into our old library. So sometimes your folders will not update. Another thing too, which is really important, is whenever you add a new library into View, it's usually a good idea to close View out and reopen it. If you're working on a file, in the meantime, save it, and if you're adding a bunch of different libraries, really load up View and load in all of those libraries, and then close it out once they're all loaded in, because if View crashes, it will not save those libraries. And now I've loaded in that new folder, basically a new collection, and now I can just drag it into our other collection. So if you ever add a new folder, you can just select it, load it in, and then drag it into the other folder that it's also a part of. So select our color first, and I'm going to load in the clip we created. You can click OK. And now we have stems as a part of our scene. We can go ahead and render this out and take a look at this current set. And we can see that looks pretty good. We don't really have any overlapping of the stems, so there won't be any problems there. And because the stems, I made them really long, a lot of them go well within the leaf. That gives us the ability to move our leaves out further if we need to, and make adjustments without that stem really being a fixed length. So there's a lot we can do with it that way. And if you want, you can also create different color stems, different variations on that, or just go into the function and create different nodes to change the color. So if we want to adjust the color right now, I can show you how to do that very quickly. We'll open up our stem material, edit our function, and for our projected texture map, I'm going to click to make that red box, add in a color map, go to color correction, change it to HLS shift, and now connect our color link to the HLS shift and the HLS shift to our projected texture map. And now we can adjust the hue to change the color, the luminosity to change the brightness. We could also adjust the saturation if we'd like it to be more gray or more intense color. So let's go ahead and make this a little more obvious. We'll change it to blue, click OK, and now when I render this, we're going to see blue stems showing up. So that's a really easy way you can just change the color without having to create a new color map, is just using that little function to create that variation. Click OK, close this out. I'm going to go back into our material and just remove that node that we just created. Click OK. And I also want to make sure I'm saving at this point. And now this is basically done. We can use it. But let's take a look at how we're going to use it before we add our color variation to the leaves, because we are going to make it a little more realistic that way. But first, let's go ahead and render and take a look at one of the problems you're going to run into, and that involves our alpha and clip map. Now, Vue has it built in where we can automatically save out our alpha based on this information with our transparency, but at the moment, our ground plane is going to interfere with that. So as we're taking a look, this will be the color we're able to save out. But if we switch to our alpha, all we see is white, and that's because our ground plane is showing up and affecting our alpha. So what we can do is go to our render options, and in the lower left, under render what, we can check hide infinite planes from alpha. and click OK. And now we don't have to worry about that ground plane showing up within the alpha or any other infinite plane that we have in the scene. Another thing you could do is just delete the ground plane entirely, and that will also take care of it. So you can either check that out in the render options, or you can just select the ground plane and delete it. And depending on whether or not you really need a fully white background, you might need to remove that ground plane. Let's go ahead and render this now and take a look once again so we can see how this has fixed our alpha and how we'd be able to use this either by itself or within our next scene we're going to be creating, which is going to be combining this branch with other branches and creating our final image map. Now we take a look at our alpha and it looks correct. And really the only other thing I would suggest, depending on how much post work you'd like to do, is this alpha is not going to be perfect. Because our background is white, and the alpha tends to have a little bit of anti-aliasing, we're going to see a white rim around the edge of all of our leaves and our branches. Now, one thing you could do is just edit your alpha within Photoshop using the paint bucket tool, select black, and just bleed in the edges a little bit more. That is one method you could do. The only problem is you have a lot of these overlaps in certain areas where you'd have to go in and select each individual spot, and that can sometimes be time consuming, really depending on the settings you have. There are certain settings in Photoshop you can use to correct that, but let's take a look at another method to really kind of fix that, and basically it involves modifying our color. So what I'm going to do is switch back to Photoshop, and we're going to create one more map, and this will really be the last one as part of this set before we can create our next scene, which is much simpler, a little bit easier to use. And in Photoshop, what I'm going to do is with our leaf file open that we used to create our leaf, I am going to just sample one of the more average colors from the leaf map, and then I can create a new layer, which I'm just going to create above every other layer. And we can go ahead and just paint the paint bucket, and turning on our middle shadow group where this is showing up. And now I'm going to save this out. Another thing you could also do is just take a look at the RGB values of this color, but I want to save this out as a specific color map. So I'll go ahead and save this out, and then we can load it in to view on a new plane and put it in the back. So I'm going to select our stems object that we have. Go ahead and hit Control-C, Control-V, move it down a little bit on the Z-axis, open up the material, and call this background, and click OK. Scale that up a bit, and I'm going to edit the function, remove the clip from the overall function, and load in our new color. And we also want to make sure we go to transparency and change that to 0 now that that function is gone. And basically all we'll need to do is hide this background from our render when we create our alpha. If we take a look, we can hide this from our render up in the top. I'm going to change the name just to background, and what you'll actually need to do is render twice. Your first render will be your color map, so we'll go ahead and render that right now, and we'll be able to use this then for our color. One thing you might want to do is maybe darken that up to match the edges of the leaves, which I did not take into consideration when I made the color. But you might want to darken it a little, and you can always do that. Really, the Photoshop method can work best sometimes, just a little bit of post-process. But if you really need to do it very quickly, then this method can end up saving you a lot of time. And because this background will interfere with our alpha to render our clip, we'll just go ahead and hide it from the render. And then when we render and access the alpha, it'll look correct. So we're just going to hide this from the render right now, and we're going to take a look at customizing these leaves that we have, just their overall color, so that it doesn't look like exactly the same leaf with exactly the same color and pattern on every one. We can customize it a little bit more to change its shape slightly, and then also color variations. And we'll go back and take a look, because you may want to change the shapes a little too to make it a little more realistic with the size option. So we'll come back to that. First, we'll take a look at just changing our color a little bit. I'm going to change this to a mixed material. And now we're going to have material 1 and material 2. I'm going to copy material 1 and paste it onto material 2. And click OK. And make sure that is showing up correctly. So now I'm going to edit material 2, edit our function, and the same way we were changing our color before, I'm going to add in a color map, color correction, HLS shift, and connect those, and now adjust our hue. And keep in mind that very small numbers will create a very big impact on the color. Just moving the slider a little bit can really change your color amount. So you just got to be a little careful to make sure you don't go too far. You click OK. And now the reason I'm using a mixed material rather than distributing two different image maps with a fractal controlling it is because sometimes you can get oversampling of color and bleeding into hues beyond what you want, and you'll have blue showing up, purple. This way we already have our materials set, and when we distribute them, we'll make sure there's no bleeding of other colors into it. So now we're going to use distribution of materials 1 and 2. I'm going to right mouse click, go to edit function, and the first thing I want to do is right mouse click in the open area, add an input node of position options. And we're going to leave this at world standard, because right now we actually have an object mode for our material, but because our leaves are in different positions, we want an overall variation. So this way we can use, instead of the standard position, which is set to object, we can use the position options, which is set to world, and this way it'll give us a variation throughout our material, even though the objects are in different places. And what I'm going to do is add in a simple fractal and disconnect from the position to the position options, connect our distribution to that fractal, and we'll just scale down the function editor a little so you can see the bottom. And now I'm just going to increase the roughness and the gain and pretty much go with the default values to begin with, just to see what it's going to look like. And we can see in the preview that we have a nice variation between the two different colors, but I might want to make that a little bit more because that might be kind of obvious in the scene. So we'll open that back up, go to the distribution, take our simple fractal, and I'm going to move this down to 0.4 on all of our axes on the wavelength, and increase our roughness a little. We could also change the type of noise we're using, but this should work out pretty well. But it looks like we have too much of a cutoff in our color. Go back, edit our function, and I'm going to decrease the gain and our roughness a little more. Decreasing the gain will give us a little bit of a better blend between our different colors, so they're not so sharp. It's not just going from the green to the yellow. Go back, edit that, what we can also do is pull down just the material editor so we can see that preview render, decrease the gain, and take a look at that overall render, maybe decrease the roughness, because we just want a little bit of a color variation, not a whole lot. And that should be good. Click OK. And now we can render this out and take a look. And we'll start to see these nice different colored leaves. So even though we have the same, basically the same image map on both, we have this nice color variation that we can use. And if you wanted to change out the leaf shape, the type of leaf map that you have, clip and color, you just have to do that for both of the materials. But it's really not that bad, because it's much easier to distribute this with a mixed material to prevent that the color bleeds that you can run into with the other methods. Now, what I was talking about with size before is right now all of these different images we have, or objects for our leaves, are all square. Well, sometimes your leaf shape won't be exactly the same every time. So what you can do is go through and change your size a little bit on some of them, squish them in. Maybe with some of them you can pull them out. But you wouldn't want to go too far beyond the overall square shape, because of course then you're going to get some interference whenever you bring in other shapes. And that's kind of the whole point of having a square template for your leaf in both View and in Photoshop. But this does give you a nice little extra variation if you just change some of the values slightly. So they're still mostly square, but it does give you a little bit of extra change on your shape, and it'll make your scene a lot more realistic. Okay, so now we can render out our color and our clip. So we're going to start by rendering our color, go to the background, turn off the hide from render. I'm also going to open up our render options and change this to Ultra 1024 by 1024, and go ahead and let that render. It's going to take a little bit longer, but our textures are going to look much better and less distorted. It'll look more like the original images and basically exactly like them that we have within Photoshop. So we'll go ahead and let that render. I'm going to save them out, and then we're going to start creating our next scene in order to combine this render with a couple of different copies of it in order to create an entire branch shape, and also a file that we can modify and edit to create a lot of different types of trees and have more template files for that as well. So we'll go ahead and save these out, and then we can move on to the next section and start working on the other file.